At 6:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in June, Brian Thompson watched his oldest son change the locks on the house Brian had spent 40 years paying off. The rain started at 6:49. By 6:52, Brian stood on the porch with two garbage bags, a dog, and the sudden understanding that his children had become strangers. The sound of the drill stopped. Kenneth Lee tested the new deadbolt with a key Brian would never hold. Click! The sound of a door closing on 40 years of fatherhood. Kenneth's custom suit, $3,000 from some Portland tailor, stayed perfectly dry under the porch overhang. Brian's flannel shirt soaked through in seconds. Rebecca Robinson stood beside her Mercedes, arms crossed, already distanced from what they were doing. Her real estate agent voice came out, smooth, practiced, empty of anything resembling doubt. The facility has activities, aqua aerobics, a meal plan. You'll be with people your own age. Brian said nothing. What was there to say? He'd raised these three children alone after Linda walked out. Kenneth was 8, then Rebecca 6, Scott barely 4, 27 years of double shifts as a software engineer, of making every school play and parent-teacher conference, of teaching them to ride bikes and balance checkbooks and treat people with basic human dignity. Or so he'd thought. Scott Hill scrolled through his phone without looking up, speaking to someone named Frankie in short-clipped sentences. 3 weeks. I know. Working on it. His hand shook, holding the device. Brian noticed and said nothing, because what would be the point? His youngest son hadn't made eye contact in months. The rain fell harder. Duke whimpered beside Brian's leg, the old blue-tick coonhound, sensing wrongness the way dogs do. Brian reached down, scratched behind those graying ears. At least they'd let him keep his dog. Small mercies in the wreckage of everything else. Kenneth finally looked up from the hardware. This is for your own good, Dad. You can't take care of yourself anymore. The house is falling apart. You're falling apart. Brian had raised his children to recognize lies. Apparently, he'd failed at that too. The house needed work that was true. The roof leaked in 2 places. The furnace rattled. Paint peeled from window frames. But Brian had maintained it as well as he could on his pension. He'd never asked them for help, never been a burden, until 3 months ago, when his knee gave out, and he'd called Kenneth because he couldn't drive himself to the emergency room. That single moment of vulnerability had changed everything. Rebecca's engagement ring caught the light. 3 carats new, expensive. Donald's money, Brian knew. Donald Thomas, the real estate developer who'd swept into Rebecca's life 2 years ago and slowly consumed it. We found a facility, Dad. Meadowbrook Senior Living. Clean, affordable. They have activities. The word affordable hung in the air like accusation. Brian watched his daughter avoid his eyes and understood they'd already listed the house. Probably with Rebecca's firm, probably calculated their cuts down to the penny before they packed his life into garbage bags while he sat in Dr. Brennan's office getting blood pressure medication he didn't need. Have you ever been judged by people who didn't know your story, who saw your silence as weakness instead of protection? That's where this begins. Kenneth held out an envelope. There's some cash for a motel tonight. We'll bring your car to Meadowbrook tomorrow with the rest of your things. Brian took the envelope without looking inside, picked up his bags. Duke's leash was already attached to his collar. They'd thought of everything, planned it down to the smallest detail. The precision of their betrayal was almost admirable. He walked down the porch steps he'd repaired a dozen times down the cracked driveway. He'd sealed every summer past the garden where he'd taught Rebecca about tomatoes and Scott about patience and Kenneth about the value of getting your hands dirty. None of them stopped him. None of them hugged him goodbye. They just watched from the porch of his house, their house now, as he walked into the rain with his dog and his garbage bags and what remained of his dignity. Brian made it 6 blocks before the shaking started, not from cold or fear, but from a rage so pure it threatened to consume him from the inside out. He sat in a bus shelter while rain drummed the plastic roof, and Duke's head grew heavy on his thigh. His phone was in his pocket, the one he'd kept secret from his children because they thought he was too old for smartphones, too addled to manage passwords and apps and the basic functions of modern life. But what nobody in that driveway knew, including Brian himself in that moment, was that 28 years earlier he'd made a choice that would change everything, and that choice was about to resurface. He pulled out the phone with shaking fingers, opened the banking app. The offshore trust account he'd set up in 1998 loaded slowly on the screen. The balance sat there in clean digital certainty, $287,492,018.43. Brian stared at the number until his eyes burned. $287 million, built from $8 million in 1994 when he sold a data compression algorithm so elegant his competitors called it Thompson's magic. Another $12 million in 1996 when he filed a derivative patent for mobile applications. 32 years of conservative investments of compound interest, doing its quiet work of never touching the principal because he'd wanted his children to value work over inheritance. The memory came sharp and immediate. 1994. Late nights in the home office, Linda already gone for 5 years, Kenneth doing homework at the kitchen table, Rebecca and Scott asleep upstairs. The breakthrough had arrived at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday, an algorithm that compressed data with almost zero loss, elegant in its simplicity, revolutionary in its application. The company he worked for offered $2 million. Brian said no. A lawyer, George White, knew his father-in-law, the man who'd raised him after Linda left, connected him with a Silicon Valley intermediary. The sale went through for $8 million clean and anonymous. Brian deposited the money in a trust, under a name no one would trace to him, lived on his engineering salary, and told no one. 2 years later, the mobile derivative patent sold for $12 million more. By then, Kenneth was in high school. Rebecca was learning to drive. Scott was discovering he could charm his way out of trouble. Brian watched the money grow and told himself he was protecting them, teaching them independence, preparing them for lives where success meant something they'd earned, not something they'd inherited. He'd planned to tell them eventually, when they were mature enough to understand, when they'd built their own careers, their own identities, their own sense of worth, separate from what he could give them. Sitting in that bus shelter with garbage bags at his feet and a dog at his side, Brian realized that day would never come. His children had become exactly what he'd feared, entitled, cruel, certain of their right to take what wasn't theirs. And they had no idea who he really was. The memory of George White's farmstead surfaced then clear and sharp. 40 acres of high desert sage in eastern Oregon left to Brian 15 years ago when George died at 94. Brian had gone to the funeral, hadn't been back since. Taxes were paid automatically from a small account. The house was probably falling apart. But it was his, truly his, in a way nothing else had been since Kenneth changed those locks. Brian stood. Duke looked up with those wise old eyes that seemed to ask if they were done waiting. "We're going home, boy." Not the home he'd just lost, but the one he'd forgotten he had. The used car lot stayed open until midnight. Brian walked in at 10:47 p.m., water still dripping from his clothes, and pointed to a Ford F-150 from 2018. The salesman, young, eager, surprised by late-night foot traffic, started his pitch. Brian cut him off. "I'll pay cash." $28,000. The salesman's expression shifted from eager to suspicious. "You're paying cash." For this, Brian counted $100 bills from an emergency account he'd maintained for situations exactly like this. The salesman's eyes widened with each stack. When Brian finished, the man hesitated, then filled out the paperwork in silence. Standard protocol required reporting cash transactions over $10,000 to the IRS. Brian didn't care. Let them investigate. They'd find accounts so clean, so properly documented, so thoroughly legitimate that even the most suspicious auditor would walk away satisfied. He loaded the garbage bags into the truck bed while the salesman processed the title transfer. Duke jumped into the passenger seat and pressed his nose to the window, watching the city lights with the kind of attention dogs reserve for moments when their entire world is about to change. The drive east took most of the night. Brian pointed the truck toward Highway 84, following the Columbia River as it cut through the gorge between Oregon and Washington. No radio, just the hum of tires on asphalt and his own thoughts for company. The anger had settled into something colder, harder. Not rage anymore, but clarity. For years he'd bent his life around his children's needs, their schedules, their approval. He'd made himself small, undemanding, grateful for whatever scraps of attention they offered. And they'd taken his humility for weakness. The highway stretched through darkness. Around midnight, the landscape transformed. Ponderosa pine gave way to juniper and sage. The air through the cracked window smelled different, drier, cleaner, touched with something ancient. This was the Oregon most people never saw. The empty quarter where towns sat 50 miles apart, and the sky went on forever. Dawn broke as Brian crossed into Morrow County. Pink light spilled across the high desert, turning the sage silver and the distant mountains purple. Duke stirred, stretched, looked at Brian with eyes that asked if they were nearly there. "Almost, boy, almost." Millbrook appeared as the sun cleared the horizon. "Population 100, the faded sign announced. One main street, false front buildings that hadn't changed since the 1950s. A hardware store, a diner, a post office, a grocery with a gas pump out front. The kind of town where everybody knew everybody, where nothing happened fast, where a man could disappear if he wanted to." Brian didn't stop. The farmstead was another 10 miles out down a county road that turned from asphalt to gravel to dirt. He recognized the turn by the lightning-struck juniper George had refused to cut down. That tree survived, his father-in-law used to say. Shows respect to leave it standing. The gate hung crooked on rusted hinges, open like an invitation. Brian shifted into low gear and crept forward, the truck bouncing over ruts he remembered from childhood summers. Then there it was, white clapboards stripped to gray by decades of sun and wind, porch sagging in the middle, several windows cracked. The roof looked intact, but probably leaked. Behind the house, the old barn leaned 10 degrees off plum red paint faded to rust. Brian killed the engine and sat in the spreading silence. 40 acres of sage and rock and memory. The fields where he'd helped George harvest hay. The creek probably dry this time of year where they'd fished for trout. The workshop where George had taught him to sharpen a saw blade and true a board edge and measure twice, cut once. A man needs land. George had told him that once, sitting on this very porch, watching the sunset behind the mountains. Brian was maybe 12, spending the summer like he did every year until high school made him too busy. Not to farm necessarily, though that's honest work, but to know he's got a place in the world that's his, ground under his feet that nobody can take away. Nobody had taken it away. Brian had just forgotten it was here. He climbed out of the truck, knees protesting after the long drive. Duke jumped down and immediately transformed nose to the ground tail, wagging chasing scents with the enthusiasm of a dog half his age. The open space seemed to give him permission to be himself again. The front door was locked, but Brian knew where George kept the spare key. Third porch board from the left, rusted coffee can underneath. The can was still there, the key inside, 40 years old and still functional. Some things didn't change. The door stuck swollen from years of weather, but yielded when Brian put his shoulder into it. Inside, the house smelled of dust and time and absence. Furniture sat under old sheets like ghosts. The kitchen table was bare, except for one item, a leather-bound journal left open, as if George had just stepped out for a moment 15 years ago. Brian walked through the rooms, cataloging damage. The living room was intact, furniture solid if dusty. The kitchen had appliances from the 1980s, but they might still work. Electricity was on. He'd kept the account active. The bathroom needed new fixtures. 2 bedrooms upstairs, one with a hole in the ceiling where the roof had leaked. Not terrible, fixable. He found himself back in the kitchen, drawn to the journal. George's handwriting remained firm and clear despite his age. The last entry was dated October the 14th, 2011, 3 days before he died. Cold snap coming. Checked on the Martin family. Joshua's grandson has pneumonia. Took them firewood and my last chicken. Not charity, just neighborly. A man takes care of his community takes care of him. That's how it's supposed to work. Brian flipped backward through the pages, reading at random. Entry after entry about helping neighbors. Loans given, never collected. Work done, never billed. A pattern of quiet generosity spanning decades. August 3, 1985, helped the Pritchard family with their barn raising. Good people, salt of the earth. This is why I stayed in Millbrook all these years. March 22, 1967. Young Martin boy needed work. Hired him for the summer, even though I don't need the help. Good kid willing to learn. His family's been struggling since the mill closed. June 7, 1943. War's hard on everyone. The Crawford family lost their son in Italy. Forgave their store account. Money doesn't matter when you've buried your child. On and on, year after year. George had lived with purpose, with generosity, with a clear understanding of what mattered. Not accumulation, but contribution. Not wealth, but worth. Brian's phone buzzed in his pocket, shattering the moment. He pulled it out, saw a string of messages from his children. Kenneth. Where are you? You're being dramatic. Call me. Rebecca. Dad, we're trying to help you. Stop being stubborn. We need to talk about the house. Scott, you can't just disappear. We have POA documents ready. This is happening whether you like it or not. Power of attorney. They actually thought they could declare him incompetent, take control of his assets, the house, his pension, the modest savings account they knew about. They had no idea about the real money, no clue that the father they'd thrown away like garbage had more wealth than they could imagine. Brian turned off the phone and slipped it into a drawer. Whatever they wanted could wait. Forever, maybe. He walked back outside where Duke was chasing a ground squirrel through the sage. The morning sun was warm now, burning off the last of the chill. The mountains stood sharp against a sky so blue it hurt to look at. A hawk circled overhead, riding the thermals with the patience of a predator who knows waiting is half the hunt. This place, this forgotten, neglected place, felt more like home than anywhere he'd been in years. The first week passed in a blur of honest work. Brian woke with the sun at 5:30 a.m., made coffee in George's dented percolator, and spent daylight hours fixing what needed fixing. He started small porch boards that sagged roof shingles that had blown loose windows painted shut for decades. Each repair revealed another the way old houses do. But the work felt good clean. Every nail he drove, every board he replaced, was a choice he made for himself. In the barn, he found George's toolbox, a heavy oak chest filled with hand tools from the 1950s. The handles were worn smooth. From decades of use, the steel still sharp. Brian ran his thumb along a chisel edge and felt the connection across time. These tools had built and fixed and created. Now they were his to carry forward. Duke adapted to country life like he'd been waiting for it his whole existence. He roamed the property each morning, checking fence lines and chasing rabbits he'd never catch. The dog seemed younger, somehow more alive. Maybe that's what freedom did, gave you permission to be yourself again. By the end of the week, Brian needed supplies. The list was long lumber nails, paint caulk, a dozen other things. He drove into Millbrook on a Thursday morning, the little town quiet, under a high blue sky. The hardware store sat on Main Street, its wooden facade painted forest green. A bell chimed as Brian pushed through the door. Inside, the place smelled of sawdust and machine oil and something indefinable that all hardware stores share, the scent of possibility, of projects waiting to be born. A man in his 70s stood behind the counter, reading glasses, perched on his nose, working through an invoice. He looked up at the bell. "Help you find something." Brian pulled out his list. "Need quite a bit, actually. Fixing up the old White place." The man's eyebrows rose. "George White's place. You family grandson. Brian Thompson." The man came around the counter, hand extended. "Joshua Martin. Your grandfather was good people. Real good people." His grip was firm, calloused, from a lifetime of work. "Haven't seen anyone out there in years." Wondered if the place was still standing. Barely. But it'll get there. Joshua spent the next hour helping Brian gather supplies, offering advice on everything from wood treatment to pump maintenance. Wells probably fine, those old deep wells last forever. But check the pressure tank. Bladder might be shot after all this time. They talked as they worked, Joshua sharing memories of George. How he'd hired Joshua as a teenager when the Martin family was struggling. How he'd been at Joshua's wedding, his father's funeral, every important moment. Never asked for anything back, just helped because that's who he was. At the register, Brian watched the total climb. $300, 400, 487. Joshua rang it up without comment, though his eyes lingered on the cash Brian pulled from his wallet. Not many people paid cash for that much anymore. "You staying out there alone?" "Just me and my dog." Joshua counted out change with careful precision. "Well, you need anything, you let me know. Good to have a white back in that house. Your grandfather would be pleased." Brian drove to the diner next, suddenly hungry. The place was classic small town. Red vinyl booth, checkered floor, a counter with swivel stools. A waitress in her late 50s moved between tables with the easy efficiency of someone who'd been doing this work for decades. Her name tag said Kathleen Robinson. "Sit anywhere, hon." Brian took a booth by the window. Kathleen appeared a moment later with coffee and a menu, her smile genuine. "Just passing through or staying a while?" "Staying. Fixing up my grandfather's place outside town." "Which grandfather?" "George White." Her face lit up in a way that made Brian's chest tighten with something he couldn't quite name. "Oh, George. He used to come in every Saturday for breakfast. Ordered the same thing for 30 years. 2 eggs over easy wheat toast, bacon crisp. Tipped like a millionaire, even though everyone knew he lived simple." She studied Brian with open curiosity. No pretense, no hidden agenda visible in her expression. "You have his eyes. Kind eyes." Something loosened in Brian's chest at those words. When was the last time someone had called him kind? He ordered the breakfast special and ate slowly, watching Millbrook through the window. People moved at a different pace here. They stopped to talk on the sidewalk, waved to passing cars. A man helped an elderly woman with her groceries without being asked, without expecting acknowledgement. It was the kind of place that didn't exist anymore, except it did. It had been here all along waiting. On the 10th day, Brian found something in George's desk. A hidden drawer, false bottom, revealed by accident when he pulled too hard on a stuck drawer above it. Inside a leather ledger from the Depression era, pages yellowed but intact. The years 1932 to 1945 were recorded in meticulous detail: names, dates, amounts. Money loaned during the Depression to families in Millbrook. Hundreds of entries spanning more than a decade. But here was the thing. Next to each loan amount was a payment record, and the payments never matched the original amounts. Sometimes they were half, sometimes a quarter, sometimes just a notation, 2 dozen eggs, and a thank you. In the margin of each entry, George had written the same 2 words in his careful hand: paid in full. Brian traced the entries with his finger, each one a window into his grandfather's soul. Martin Joshua Sr., $200, 1932, paid $47 plus summer labor. Paid in full. Pritchard family, $150, 1934, paid what they could spare. Paid in full. Crawford family, $300, 1936, paid their gratitude. Paid in full. George had given without expecting return, had helped people get back on their feet, then forgiven the debt. Over and over, year after year, a pattern of generosity that asked nothing back. Brian sat back in the desk chair, ledger open on his lap. He had $287 million gathering interest in accounts he never touched. Money he'd earned through his own work but never needed. What was it for if not this, if not continuing what George had started? The idea took shape slowly, carefully, like good carpentry. Anonymous help, for people who deserved it. Quiet generosity without expectation or recognition. Not charity. George would have hated that word. Just neighborly. Just human. He'd have to be careful. Research who needed help and why. Make sure they were genuine, hard-working people facing genuine hardship through no fault of their own. George hadn't helped everyone, Brian realized. Only those who would use the help wisely, who'd work hard, who'd pay it forward when they could. Brian pulled out a notebook and started making notes. The hardware store Joshua had mentioned, his grandson needed surgery, something expensive the insurance wouldn't cover. The library he'd noticed driving through town had a tarp on the roof. The young mother whose car had broken down in the grocery store parking lot, counting change for a tow truck. Not everyone, just those who deserved it, just like George had done. Outside, the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky orange and pink. Duke barked at something in the sage. The house creaked around him, settling into evening. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Brian Thompson felt purposeful, useful, alive. His phone, the one he'd turned off and hidden in a drawer, began to ring. The vibration was muffled, but persistent. Brian retrieved it, saw Kenneth's number on the screen. Let it ring 3 times, 4, 5. On the 6th ring he answered. Kenneth's voice came through tight with controlled anger. "Dad, where are you? We've been trying to reach you for 12 days. I've been busy. Busy." A pause heavy with disbelief. "We thought you were dead. Or worse." Brian looked out the kitchen window at the mountains at the last light, fading from their peaks. "What's worse than dead? Don't be cute. Where are you? Does it matter?" "Of course it matters. We had police do a wellness check at Meadowbrook. You never showed up. They want to file a missing person report. I'm not missing. I'm exactly where I want to be." Silence on the line. 6 seconds. 7. Then Kenneth's lawyer voice emerged, the one that won cases and intimidated opponents and had probably made him a fortune before whatever trouble he was in now. "Dad, you're not thinking clearly. You left with nothing. No plan, no support system. This is exactly why we were concerned about your judgment. My judgment is fine. Is it? Because from where I'm standing, you've abandoned your family, ignored your responsibilities, and disappeared to God knows where. That's not the behavior of someone who's thinking rationally." The words landed like punches, designed to wound, to make Brian doubt himself. Kenneth had used this tactic for years, subtle undermining disguised as concern. Brian recognized it now, saw it for what it was. "I need to go. We're selling the house." Kenneth's voice hardened, losing the pretense of worry. "The papers are drawn up. We need your signature." "You're not getting it, Dad." "I said no, Kenneth. The house is mine. You can't sell it without me." "We'll see about that." The threat was clear, naked, unashamed. "We have options. Legal options. Do what you need to do." Brian hung up before Kenneth could respond. His hands shook not from fear, but from the effort of staying calm, of not saying the things he wanted to say. Things about 27 years of raising children who'd become strangers. Things about sacrifice unacknowledged and love unreturned. Things about 8-year-old Kenneth crying after Linda left, and Brian sitting up all night promising everything would be okay, and maybe that was the lie that started all the others. Duke whimpered, sensing distress. Brian knelt and buried his face in the dog's fur, breathing in the smell of sage and dust and unconditional loyalty. Dogs didn't betray you, didn't pretend to care while plotting how to use you. didn't take 40 years of devotion and reduce it to an obstacle between them and money they thought they deserved. It makes you wonder how many families break not from lack of love, but from failure to see each other clearly. Kenneth thought he was saving his father. Brian thought he was teaching his children independence. And neither could hear the other anymore. Brian walked to George's journal and made his first entry in 15 years. Day 12. Kenneth Rebecca Scott threw me away. They think I'm broken helpless, a burden to be managed. They have no idea who I am, no idea what I've built. Tomorrow, I start fixing this house, and then I start fixing Millbrook, not because I need their gratitude, because George taught me that a man's worth isn't measured in what he has, but in what he gives, and I have a lot to give. He closed the journal and set it beside George's. 2 generations of men who'd learned that wealth without purpose was just numbers on a screen. That family was who stood beside you when everything fell apart, not who waited for you to die so they could divide what you left behind. The phone buzzed again. Another text from Kenneth, then Rebecca, then Scott. Brian turned it off and put it back in the drawer. Whatever they wanted could wait. They'd made their choices. Now he would make his. Outside, stars blazed across the desert sky in a way they never did in Portland. Duke followed Brian onto the porch and settled at his feet, warm and solid and real. The house creaked with the wind, with age, with the promise of work ahead. Tomorrow, Brian would continue the repairs, would research the families who needed help, would start becoming the man George had shown him how to be. His children had thrown him away because they thought he was worthless. They were wrong about the money, but that wasn't what mattered. What mattered was this: he'd built a life he was proud of once before the weight of their judgment crushed it into something small and apologetic, before he'd learned to make himself invisible to avoid their disappointment. Out here, with 40 acres of sage and sky and possibility stretching in every direction, Brian Thompson began to remember who he was. And the person he remembered was someone his grandfather would have recognized, someone his children had never bothered to meet. The night air smelled of rain coming through the sky, showed no clouds. Brian breathed it in, the scent of transformation, of endings that made space for beginnings. Duke's breathing slowed into sleep. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, and somewhere in the darkness an owl called across the emptiness, hunting for what moved in the shadows. Brian smiled into that darkness. Let them come with their lawyers and their documents and their absolute certainty that they knew what was best. Let them try to prove he couldn't take care of himself, couldn't make rational decisions, couldn't live without their intervention. He'd show them something they'd never seen before, the man he'd always been underneath their expectations, the man who'd built something they couldn't imagine from silence and secrecy, and the belief that his children deserved to find their own way. They'd find out eventually. The money, the patents, the decades of careful planning. They'd learn that their broken, incompetent father had been playing a different game all along. But by then, by the time they understood what they'd thrown away, it would be too late to take back the cruelty, the dismissal, the garbage bags on the porch in the rain. Some lessons could only be learned through loss. Brian had learned that when Linda left, when the woman he'd loved disintegrated into someone he didn't recognize, consumed by an illness she refused to acknowledge, and all he could do was hold their children while they cried and lie about why their mother wasn't coming back. He'd protected them from that truth, hidden Linda's psychiatric records, her diagnosis, her refusal of treatment. Let them think she'd chosen to leave rather than explain that her mind had broken in ways she couldn't control. Another secret meant to shield them, to spare them pain. Another silence that had done more harm than truth ever could. Tomorrow he'd begin again, with honest work and open giving, with community earned rather than assumed, with the kind of life George had shown him was possible, one where worth came from contribution, where wealth was measured in connection, where family was, who chose to stand beside you rather than who shared your blood. But tonight he sat with his dog and his grief and his slowly building rage that tasted like freedom, because rage, properly directed, could burn away everything false and leave only what mattered. And what mattered wasn't the money or the house or the vindication he'd feel when they learned the truth. What mattered was the hawk circling overhead at dawn. The smell of coffee in George's kitchen, the weight of Duke's head on his thigh, the knowledge that somewhere in Millbrook families were struggling and he had the power to help without asking for anything in return except the privilege of being part of something larger than himself. His children had given him a gift, though they'd never understand it. They'd given him permission to stop performing for their approval, to stop shrinking himself to fit their image of what an aging father should be, to stop hiding the fullness of who he was and what he'd accomplished out of fear they'd love the money more than they'd ever loved him. The gift was freedom. The price was everything he'd spent 40 years building. And as Brian Thompson sat on his grandfather's porch, watching stars burn in the high desert darkness, he discovered something George had known all along. Some things were worth the cost. The Millbrook Library occupied a converted house on 2nd Street, its single room lined with mismatched shelves donated over decades. Brian arrived on a Wednesday morning in his 3rd week ostensibly to research property records. The librarian, a woman in her 70s named Martha, pointed him toward the microfiche machine without questions. Brian spent 2 hours going through county records, tax assessments, news archives from the weekly Millbrook Chronicle. Tyler Martin's name appeared in a fundraiser announcement from 3 months prior. 12 years old, rare kidney condition, experimental surgery, not covered by insurance. Cost $43,000. The article mentioned Joshua Martin working double shifts at the hardware store, the family still $15,000 short. Brian made notes, verified the hospital through a phone call, claiming to be a potential donor, requiring confirmation before releasing funds. The billing office confirmed the amount, the timeline, the family's situation, real need, deserving people. George would have approved. That evening, Brian drove to the Martin house, a small ranch on the east side of town, lights burning warm against the gathering dark. He'd prepared an envelope with $43,000 in cash, bundled in hundreds, wrapped in plain paper. The note inside said, "Only from someone who remembers George White's kindness. For Tyler, no repayment expected." Brian walked to the door at 11 p.m. when the lights finally went dark, slid the envelope through the mail slot, heard it hit the floor inside, walked back to his truck, and drove away before anyone could see his face. At the farmstead, Duke waited on the porch. Brian scratched behind the dog's ears and felt something shift in his chest. Not pride exactly, more like alignment. The money had sat idle for decades, compounding in silence. Now it would move, would breathe, would become something more than numbers on a screen. He opened George's journal and wrote, "First gift, Tyler Martin Surgery Fund. I hope I'm doing this right." 3 days later, Joshua called Brian's cell. The number Brian had left at the hardware store written on the back of a receipt. "Can you come by the store? Need to talk." Brian arrived at noon. Joshua locked the front door and led him to the back office, pulled out an empty envelope, the one Brian had used, and set it on the desk between them. "Someone left this. $43,000. Exact amount Tyler needs." Brian kept his expression neutral, a skill learned from 30 years of hiding wealth. "That's wonderful. Who?" Joshua's eyes held the weight of 50 years watching this town, knowing its rhythms, recognizing patterns. "Anonymous. But I've lived here my whole life. Only a handful of people knew Tyler's surgery cost exactly that much. You're one of them." Brian said nothing. Let the silence stretch. "If it was you—" Joshua stopped, started again. "You didn't have to. Whoever it was probably thought you'd do the same for them." Joshua studied Brian's face with the intensity of someone searching for confirmation he already had. "George did this kind of thing. Helped quiet. Never wanted credit. Sounds like a good man. So are you." Joshua extended his hand. Brian shook it, then left before gratitude could become uncomfortable. The library roof repair took longer to arrange. Brian called contractors from Pendleton, got quotes selected, the most reasonable. $28,000 for new shingles flashing structural reinforcement. He had a cashier's check made out to the Millbrook Library Board with a note, "For roof repair, in memory of George White." The check arrived at Martha's desk on a Tuesday. By Wednesday, the whole town knew. Anonymous donation, enough to fix the leak that had threatened to close the children's section, enough to show someone cared whether Millbrook's kids had access to books. Brian heard about it at the diner during Thursday breakfast. Kathleen brought coffee and news in equal measure. Library got a donation, $28,000. Martha's beside herself. That's generous. Kathleen's smile carried knowledge she didn't plan to share. "Seems like Millbrook's luck is changing lately." Tyler Martin's surgery got funded last week. Both anonymous. Brian sipped his coffee and watched the street through the window. Maybe someone's paying forward kindness they once received. Maybe. Kathleen refilled his cup without being asked. Or maybe George White's grandson learned something important from a good man. She walked away before Brian could respond, leaving him with the understanding that secrets in small towns had short lifespans. The question wasn't whether people would figure it out. The question was what they'd do when they did. The Millbrook Clinic occupied a converted dental office on Main Street. Brian went for a blood pressure check. Robert Williams had insisted on current medical documentation and noticed equipment that belonged in a museum. X-ray machine from the 1990s. Exam tables with cracked vinyl. A waiting room full of people who deserved better. Dr. Stephanie Harris was younger than Brian expected, maybe 45, with the efficient manner of someone who'd learned to do more with less. She took his blood pressure 128/78 down from 145/92 in Portland and made notes. "Whatever you're doing out here, keep doing it. Your markers are better than they've been in years." Brian made his own notes, contacted medical supply companies, arranged for new X-ray equipment and exam tables to be delivered and installed. $35,000 paid through the same trust account structure he'd used for decades. Anonymous again, though the pattern was becoming obvious. The Johnson farm sat 10 miles outside Millbrook, 300 acres that had been in the family since 1889. Brian learned about their tax trouble from Sandra Anderson's article in the Chronicle, a piece about declining rural prosperity family farms lost to foreclosure. The Johnsons owed $18,000 in back taxes. County sale scheduled for September. Brian paid it directly to the tax assessor's office. Cashier's check, no name. The Johnsons would get notification that their debt had been cleared. They'd never know who saved them. $124,000 in 4 weeks. Brian's fortune dropped from $287,492,018 to $279,876,421. The difference was invisible, meaningless. But 4 families' lives had changed in ways that would ripple forward for generations. Kathleen sat across from him during the Friday dinner rush, settling into the booth with the casualness of someone who'd earned the right to invade his solitude. Interesting things happening in Millbrook. Tyler Martin's surgery got funded, library getting a new roof, clinic got equipment, Johnson Farm saved from foreclosure. Brian kept his face blank. That's great news. All anonymous donations, all within 4 weeks. All since you arrived. Coincidence! Kathleen's smile was warm, conspiratorial, completely free of judgment. I don't believe in coincidences, but I also don't believe in forcing people to take credit they don't want. She patted his hand, the touch brief, electric, startling in its casualness. Whoever's doing this, they're giving Millbrook hope. That's worth more than the money. Brian relaxed a fraction. She knew, but she wouldn't push, wouldn't expose him before he was ready to be exposed. Just so you know, people will figure it out eventually. And when they do, you'll have to decide if you want to hide or belong. The certified letter arrived at the farmstead on a Wednesday morning, delivered by a postal carrier who apologized for the formality. Legal documents always made him nervous, he said, like delivering bad news. Brian signed for it and waited until the truck disappeared down the dirt road before opening the envelope. Inside, notice of petition for emergency conservatorship, filed by Kenneth Lee, Rebecca Robinson, Scott Hill. Attorney of record, Richard Miller and Associates, Portland, Oregon. The grounds were listed in numbered paragraphs, each one a knife disguised as concern. Respondent exhibits signs of dementia and paranoid delusions regarding family relationships. Respondent living in unsafe, unsanitary conditions detrimental to health and welfare. Respondent making irrational financial decisions without family consultation. Respondent has isolated himself from support systems and refuses reasonable assistance. Supporting documentation included photographs of the farmstead taken from angles that made it look abandoned. A statement from Dr. Roland Webb, a psychiatrist Brian had never met, diagnosing him with grandiose delusions and impaired judgment based on behavioral patterns. Medical records that claimed Brian had missed appointments he'd never scheduled. The hearing was set for August 8th. 6 weeks away. Brian's hands shook, holding the papers, not from fear, from the recognition that his children were willing to lie, to fabricate evidence, to destroy his autonomy, rather than admit they were wrong. They'd crossed a line he hadn't known existed, had moved from greed to cruelty with a casualness that suggested they didn't see the difference. Duke pressed against his leg. Brian knelt and buried his face in the dog's fur until the shaking stopped. Pendleton was 2 hours east, the nearest city with estate lawyers who specialized in conservatorship defense. Brian made the drive on a Thursday truck radio silent mind, working through scenarios. Robert Williams practiced in a converted house near the courthouse, his office lined with law books and framed degrees that suggested competence without arrogance. Brian told him everything, not the money, not yet, but the eviction, the petition, the obvious desperation driving his children's actions. Robert listened without interrupting, taking occasional notes in a leather portfolio. When Brian finished, Robert leaned back in his chair. 3 adult children, all financially desperate, based on what you've described. House worth $600,000. And they claim you're incompetent. I'm not. I can see that. But courts don't always see clearly. They see patterns. Elderly man living alone, estranged from family judges, worry about vulnerability even when it's manufactured. So they can just take my autonomy. Not if we build a stronger case than theirs. Robert ticked off points on his fingers. Medical evaluation, physical, cognitive, psychiatric, character witnesses from Millbrook community, property inspection showing the farmstead is safe, financial documentation proving competent money management. He paused. There's one thing that would end this immediately. Brian waited. Proof of financial stability. If you have assets, retirement accounts, investments that show you're not destitute, that destroys their narrative completely. Brian's pulse quickened. How much would it take? Depends. 6 figures would help. 7 would be definitive. Brian pulled out his checkbook, wrote a check for $5,000 from the small account. Robert's retainer. The lawyer's eyes widened slightly at the amount, but he remained professional. I'll start paperwork today. But Brian, you need to think about whether you want to fight this quietly or expose everything, because discovery in conservatorship cases is thorough. If you have assets, they'll come out anyway. The drive back to Millbrook gave Brian 2 hours to think. The secret had protected him for 28 years, had shaped his relationship with his children, his sense of self, his entire adult life. Revealing the fortune would change everything, not just with Kenneth, Rebecca, and Scott, but with Millbrook, with Kathleen, with the life he was building from scratch. But maybe that was the point. Maybe secrets had done more harm than protection. Maybe it was time to let the truth do its work, whatever the cost. The box waited in the attic where Brian had left it weeks ago, marked in Linda's handwriting, personal, 1999. He'd found it during his initial cleaning, but hadn't opened it, hadn't been ready to face whatever memories it contained. Now he carried it down to the kitchen, set it on George's table, opened the flaps with hands that remembered Linda's touch, her laugh, the way she'd looked at him before the illness consumed her. Inside, psychiatric evaluation papers from Oregon Health Sciences University. Admission date, March 14, 1999. Patient Linda Brown Thompson, diagnosis bipolar 1. Disorder with psychotic features, severe postpartum depression. Brian spread the papers across the table. Hospital discharge notes. Treatment recommendations refused. Risk assessments predicting family abandonment. The clinical language couldn't hide the tragedy. A woman whose mind had broken in ways she couldn't control a family she'd loved enough to leave rather than damage further. Beneath the medical documents, letters. 10 to Kenneth, 10 to Rebecca, 10 to Scott. All written but never sent, sealed in envelopes Linda must have prepared before she left. Brian opened Kenneth's first letter with trembling fingers. My darling boy, I'm leaving because I'm sick, and I'm afraid I'll hurt you. Not with my hands, never that, but with my broken mind that sees threats where there are none, that hears voices telling me terrible things. Your father is strong. He'll raise you right. I'm not strong enough. Someday, maybe you'll understand that leaving was the only way I could protect you. I love you more than breathing. That's why I have to stop breathing your air. Mom. Rebecca's letter. You look just like me, baby girl. I hope you don't inherit my broken brain. If you do get help, don't run like I'm running. Don't let pride and shame destroy you the way they're destroying me. You deserve better than what I can give. Be brave in ways I never could. Scott's. You're 3 years old. You won't remember me. Maybe that's better. Maybe you'll grow up thinking your mom was strong enough to stay, but I'm not. I'm broken, and I'm scared, and I'm leaving before I do something we'll all regret. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I love you even though you'll never know it. Brian read all 30 letters, felt 27 years of lies crumble under the weight of Linda's truth. He'd hidden her illness to protect the children, to spare them the knowledge that their mother hadn't chosen to abandon them. But the hiding had taught them something worse, that people who loved you could disappear without explanation, that trust was conditional, that vulnerability was dangerous. His secrecy about Linda had shaped their entire understanding of family. And his secrecy about money had reinforced the lesson that fathers kept secrets, that truth was negotiable, that the people who were supposed to protect you couldn't be trusted with who they really were. Brian gathered the letters into a pile. Tomorrow he'd drive to Pendleton for his medical evaluation. And when this went to court, he'd reveal everything, the money and the mental illness and the decades of choices that had seemed wise in the moment, but had cost more than he'd ever imagined. Because Rebecca was right. No more secrets, even when truth hurt more than lies ever could. Dr. Stephanie Harris put Brian through 4 hours of evaluation at Pendleton Medical Center. Physical exam, blood pressure, excellent arthritis, mild cardiovascular system, strong for his age. Cognitive testing, memory, sharp problem-solving skills, above average. Spatial reasoning in the 96th percentile, psychological screening, no depression, minimal anxiety, clear judgment, intact sense of self. You're in better shape than men 20 years younger. Dr. Harris made notes in her tablet. Whatever you're doing in Millbrook, it's working. Your stress markers have dropped significantly. The environment change was therapeutic. Brian thought about garbage bags in the rain, about locks changing while he watched, about children who'd seen him as a problem to solve rather than a person to love. I was in a toxic situation. Leaving helped. Then keep leaving. Dr. Harris smiled. My professional opinion, you're one of the healthiest 60-year-olds I've evaluated. Certainly not someone who needs a conservator. In Portland, Kenneth stared at the Oregon State Bar letterhead for the 15th time that week. Investigation, RE trust account discrepancies. The words hadn't changed. Still accused him of misappropriating $67,000 from client funds. Still threatened disbarment if he couldn't make restitution by September 1st. He'd taken the money for Emma's medical bills when insurance denied coverage for her congenital heart defect. Had planned to replace it before anyone noticed. But then the market crashed and his investments tanked, and suddenly there was no way to cover the gap without selling something large, like his father's house. His wife, Maggie, stood in the doorway of his home office. arms crossed, face tight with worry. Did he sign? Kenneth closed the laptop. He walked away. Emma's surgery is in 8 weeks. We need that money, Kenneth. I know. Kenneth's voice came out hollow. Richard says conservatorship is the only option now. Maggie moved closer, her anger shifting to something that looked like fear. And you're comfortable with that? Declaring your father incompetent so we can take his house. Kenneth looked at the photo on his desk. Emma, at 6 years old, smiling, unaware that her heart was failing by degrees, that without surgery she'd die before her 8th birthday. I'm not stealing from my father. I'm saving my daughter. The justification sounded thin, even to his own ears. But what choice did he have? Let Emma die to preserve his father's dignity. Kenneth had made worse bargains than that. Rebecca sat in her condo and watched Donald Thomas throw another glass at the wall. It shattered 3 feet from her head, close enough that she felt the spray of wine and broken crystal against her cheek. Your father is stalling. Donald's face was red with rage and alcohol. I have $340,000 in liens on properties that aren't selling. Your father is sitting on $600,000 in equity. Get it done. Rebecca's hands shook. I'm trying. Try harder. Donald moved closer, his breath sour with wine and fury. Or I go to the real estate board about those appraisals you forged on my projects. See how that goes for your career. The threat was familiar, well-worn from 3 years of repetition. Rebecca had signed documents inflating property values to help Donald secure loans he couldn't afford. He'd kept copies, had evidence that would destroy her license, her reputation, her entire professional life. She looked at the photo on her end table. Linda holding baby Rebecca, both of them smiling. Rebecca looked just like her mother, same dark hair, same sharp cheekbones, same eyes that held too much pain. She was repeating Linda's pattern, staying in a toxic relationship out of fear, letting someone else's cruelty define the boundaries of her life. The conservatorship hearing is in 6 weeks. Rebecca's voice came out small. Richard Miller says we'll win. You better. Donald grabbed his keys. I'm going out. When I get back, I want to hear you've convinced your brothers this has to happen fast. He slammed the door hard enough to rattle the windows. Rebecca sat in the silence and wondered how much longer she could sustain the lie that this was love. Scott's phone lit up at 2 a.m. The name on the screen, Frankie. He considered not answering. Considered throwing the phone out the window and pretending the debt would disappear if he just ignored it long enough. But debts to people like Frankie didn't disappear. They compounded with violence. You're 2 months behind. Frankie's voice was calm, which somehow made it worse. That's $85,000 with interest. I need payment in 4 weeks, or we have a problem. Scott's apartment was small, messy, smelled like failure. I'm working on it. Family asset liquidation. Your father's house. Yeah, you mentioned. Frankie's pause held weight. Clock's ticking, Scott. You know what happens when clocks run out. The call ended. Scott sat in darkness and thought about the swing set in the backyard of the house Kenneth had just sold. About Brian pushing him higher, teaching him to pump his legs, catch air, feel free. About how he'd turned freedom into recklessness, turned risk into addiction, turned a father's love into just another resource to exploit when the gambling debts got too deep. The group text chain lit up at dawn. Kenneth, he won't answer phone. No idea where he went. Rebecca, I checked Meadowbrook. He never showed. Should we file missing person Scott? Give him 24 hours. He's probably at a motel feeling sorry for himself. Kenneth. We proceed with conservatorship. Richard needs medical records. Rebecca. I'll get them from Dr. Brennan's office. Scott. What if he fights it? Kenneth. Richard says, it doesn't matter. Dad's 60 alone? Unemployed house falling apart. We have plenty for incompetence. Rebecca. This feels wrong. Kenneth. Emma's dying. Rebecca. You want to explain to a 7-year-old why Grandpa's stubbornness killed her? Rebecca didn't respond, just stared at her phone and felt the last piece of herself, the piece that remembered what integrity felt like, crumble into dust. Sandra Anderson had been a journalist for 12 years, most of them covering small-town Oregon for papers nobody outside the state had heard of. The Millbrook Chronicle paid barely enough to cover rent, but it let her write stories that mattered to people who actually read them. The pattern of anonymous donations caught her attention during her weekly review of City Council minutes. 4 major gifts in 6 weeks, all anonymous, all transformative for the recipients. That wasn't normal. Normal was bake sales and car washes and desperate crowdfunding campaigns. Normal wasn't $43,000 appearing in an envelope. She started investigating, interviewed Joshua Martin, who confirmed Tyler's surgery fund, but wouldn't speculate about the donor. Talked to Martha at the library, who showed her the cashier's check for $28,000. Visited Dr. Harris at the clinic, who described new equipment arriving without explanation. The article wrote itself. Sandra titled it, Mystery Donor Transforms Millbrook, $124,000 in 6 weeks. She quoted recipients' described impact, speculated carefully about possible sources without naming names. The piece ran on Thursday. By Friday, it had been picked up by the Pendleton paper. By Monday, Portland stations were calling it the feel-good story of the summer, mysterious millionaire, helping rural town. Brian read the article over breakfast at the diner. Kathleen refilled his coffee and said nothing, but her smile held understanding. You're about to become famous. Brian folded the paper. I was trying to avoid that. Too late. Kathleen sat across from him. Town meeting's been called for Saturday night. People want to thank whoever's been helping. I don't need thanks. No. Kathleen's hand found his across the table. But maybe you need to stop hiding. Maybe that's the point. 150 people packed into Millbrook Community Church on Saturday evening. More than Brian had expected, more than could comfortably fit in the space. They stood along the walls, sat on the floor, filled every pew with the kind of attention that suggested something important was happening. Brian sat in the back with Duke, trying to remain invisible. It didn't work. Joshua Martin spoke first. Whoever you are, you saved my grandson's life. Tyler's surgery is next week. He'll live because of you. The crowd erupted in applause. Brian felt his chest tighten. Martha from the library. Our children now have computers. They can compete with schools in cities. They have access to information that will shape their futures. Dr. Harris. New equipment means we can diagnose conditions we'd have missed before. Lives will be saved. The Johnson family farmer, I was going to lose my family's land. Someone I don't know saved 3 generations. Then Kathleen stood. Her voice carried across the crowded space with the authority of someone who'd lived in Millbrook her entire life. I think I know who it is, and I think he's here tonight. Brian's pulse hammered. Duke pressed closer. Brian Thompson, George White's grandson. Every head turned. 150 pairs of eyes found him in the back row. Brian stood slowly, Duke beside him, feeling exposed in ways he'd spent decades avoiding. Kathleen continued, George spent 50 years helping this town. His grandson is doing the same. If I'm wrong, Brian can say so. But if I'm right, we owe him our thanks. 5 seconds of silence. Then Brian's voice. George taught me that community isn't about taking credit. It's about taking care of each other. He hadn't confirmed, hadn't denied, had threaded the needle between truth and privacy in a way that satisfied no one completely but acknowledged everything. Then let us take care of you. Joshua's voice carried weight. We heard about the legal trouble. Your children trying to declare you incompetent. Brian's surprise must have shown on his face. Sandra raised her hand. I'm a reporter. I investigated. Your children filed a conservatorship petition. Hearings in 2 weeks. We're testifying for you. Joshua gestured to the crowd. All of us who want to. 60 hands rose. 60 people willing to spend a day in Pendleton Courthouse defending a man they'd known for 6 weeks. Brian felt something crack in his chest, not breaking, but opening, making space for connection he'd forgotten how to accept. You don't have to. Yes, we do. Kathleen's voice was gentle but firm, because George would have done it for any of us. And you're George's family. That makes you ours. After the meeting, Kathleen asked Brian to her house for coffee. The invitation felt like more than caffeine, and Brian followed her truck through dark streets to a small home on Third Warm Lights. In the windows, photos of grown sons visible through the glass. Inside, the house smelled like cinnamon and old books. Kathleen made coffee in silence, while Brian studied family pictures on the walls. 2 young men in graduation gowns, wedding photos, grandchildren. Your boys. Brian's voice felt rough from the emotion of the evening. Kathleen handed him a mug. In Seattle. Visit maybe twice a year. They're good men, but they're busy. Too busy to remember their mother exists outside of holidays. Brian recognized the pain in her words. Mirror of his own. Your kids don't see you, do they? Kathleen settled onto the couch, leaving space for Brian beside her. He sat. They see a problem to solve. Not a person. My boys do the same. Not as extreme as yours, but they've reduced me to mom-shaped obligation. They call on my birthday, send flowers on Mother's Day, and think that's enough. She pulled out a box from under the coffee table. Letters from her sons written when they were younger. Loving, grateful, full of the kind of unguarded affection children show before life teaches them to be cautious. They didn't start out cold. Kathleen's fingers traced the edges of envelopes she'd clearly read many times. Life did that. Jobs stressed their own problems. They forgot. I'm not just Mom. I'm Kathleen, a person with thoughts and fears and the need to matter beyond my biological function. Did you tell them I tried? She smiled sadly. They nodded and promised to visit more, then didn't, because telling people they're hurting you only works if they're willing to see it. The understanding between them was immediate, visceral, born from parallel wounds. Brian reached for her hand without planning the gesture. Kathleen's fingers laced through his with the naturalness of 2 people who'd been waiting to stop being alone. You're doing something they'll never understand until it's too late. Her voice held admiration mixed with sorrow. You're living for yourself, not waiting for them to validate you. What if I could prove to them I'm not broken? Would that change anything? Only if they want to see. Some people need to believe you're broken because it justifies their choices. The kiss happened without discussion. Gentle, careful two people scared of being hurt again, finding comfort in shared recognition. Kathleen pulled back first, her eyes searching Brian's face. "Sorry, I shouldn't have." "Don't be." Brian's thumb traced her cheekbone. "I just need to get through the hearing first. Then we'll figure out what this is. Deal?" Kathleen's smile held promise. "But, Brian, whatever happens in that courtroom, you're not alone. Remember that." Donald was waiting when Rebecca got home from the town meeting, drunk furious about news he'd gotten from Richard Miller that the case was getting complicated. Witnesses, community support, medical evaluations showing competence. Your father's got a whole town defending him. Donald grabbed Rebecca's arm, hard enough to leave marks. "Richard says the case is harder now." Rebecca tried to pull away. "I'm doing everything I can." His hand connected with her face. The slap wasn't hard enough to knock her down, but it was the first time he'd crossed from grabbing to hitting. The line they'd both pretended existed had finally dissolved. "You're going to testify." Donald's breath was hot against her face. "You're going to say he's delusional. You're going to help us win this, or I'll report those appraisals to the state board and you'll never work again." Rebecca made her decision in that moment, not consciously, just instinctively, the way a trapped animal finally realizes the cage door has been open the entire time. She grabbed her keys, walked out while Donald was still yelling, got in her Mercedes, and drove east through darkness toward the only place she could think to go. Millbrook, the farmstead, her father. Brian answered the door at 11 p.m. to find Rebecca crying on his porch. Duke barked once, then settled when he recognized her scent. Brian opened the door wider. "Rebecca." She collapsed into his arms. The words came in gasps between sobs. Donald's abuse, the forged appraisals he had evidence of, his threat to destroy her career if she didn't testify against Brian, the debt, $340,000 in liens on properties that would never sell, the trapped feeling of a life that had become a cage. "I chose wrong." Rebecca's voice broke. "I chose him over you. I chose saving myself over doing what's right." Brian led her inside, made tea, let her cry until the tears stopped coming. Then he went to the attic and brought down the box he'd found weeks ago, Linda's letters. Rebecca read them by lamplight while Duke slept at her feet, and Brian watched his daughter's face transform, watched understanding replace decades of anger, watched the narrative she'd built about her mother crumble under the weight of truth. "She didn't abandon us." Rebecca's voice was small, young, the voice of a 6-year-old who'd spent 27 years believing she wasn't enough to make her mother stay. She was sick. Brian's throat tightened, mentally ill in ways she couldn't control. "I thought hiding it protected you. I was wrong. We spent 30 years hating her for something beyond her control. I'm sorry. I should have told you when you were old enough to understand." Rebecca looked at her father with eyes that finally saw him clearly. "I'm like her, aren't I? Trapped in bad situations, making wrong choices out of fear. You're also like her in another way. You're strong enough to leave. Where do I go? Here, stay here, rebuild. Figure out who you are without him. Rebecca stayed that night in the guest bedroom Brian had cleaned weeks ago. The next morning she called Robert Williams and formally withdrew from the conservatorship petition, agreed to testify for Brian instead of against him, filed police reports about Donald's physical abuse. Donald found out by noon, left 17 voicemails, each one more threatening than the last, called Kenneth with the news, "Your sister betrayed us. She's with your father." Kenneth's response was cold, calculated, born from desperation. "Then we move forward without her." Brian's phone rang on a Saturday morning. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer. Then remembered Emma's surgery was approaching and thought it might be hospital-related. A child's voice. "Is this Grandpa?" "Brian?" Time stopped. "Emma, Daddy's at work. Mommy let me call. She gave me your number." Maggie's small rebellion. Kenneth's wife finding courage Brian hadn't known she possessed. "Daddy says you don't want to see me." Emma's voice held the kind of directness only 7-year-olds managed. "Is that true?" Brian's eyes burned. "No, sweetheart, that's not true at all. Can I meet you? I have to have surgery, and I'm scared. Daddy says you used to make him feel brave when he was little." The knife twisted. "I'd love to meet you, Emma. Tell your mommy yes." They arranged it for the following Saturday. Maggie would drive Emma to Millbrook while Kenneth was in Portland for depositions. Brian spent the week preparing, cleaned the house more thoroughly, bought groceries a child might eat, let Duke get used to the idea that a small person would be invading his territory. Emma arrived at 10 a.m. wearing a Wonder Woman t-shirt and light-up sneakers. She was small for 7, thin in the way sick children often are, but her eyes were bright with curiosity. She ran to Brian and hugged him without hesitation, without the wariness adults learned from disappointment. "You look like Daddy, but nicer." Brian laughed, despite himself. "Your daddy's a good man. He's just lost right now." Maggie stood by the car watching. She was younger than Brian expected, maybe 35, with the exhausted expression of someone carrying weight too heavy for one person. "Thank you for seeing her. Kenneth doesn't know I'm here. I'm glad you came." They spent the day together. Emma helped Brian fix a section of fence, holding nails, handing tools, chattering about school and friends, and the surgery that would either fix her heart or end her life. Duke let Emma ride on his back, patient and gentle, in the way old dogs are with vulnerable things. George's journal fascinated Emma. She asked Brian to read entries, listen to stories about a great-great-grandfather who'd helped everyone and expected nothing back. "Your grandpa was like a superhero." Emma's voice held awe. "He helped everyone. He taught me to do the same. Why doesn't Daddy want you in my life?" Brian chose honesty. "Because he thinks I don't have anything to give you. He thinks I'm old and broken. That's silly." Emma's conviction was absolute. "You fixed this whole house, and you make me feel safe. That's something important." Maggie pulled Brian aside while Emma played with Duke. "Kenneth doesn't know I'm here. He'd be furious. But Emma deserves to know you. Thank you for what it's worth." Maggie's voice dropped. "I told Kenneth to drop the conservatorship. He won't. He's too scared of losing everything. Tell him I'll help with Emma's surgery. No conditions. Just tell him." They left at 4. Emma cried, not wanting to go, extracting promises that Brian would visit her in the hospital. After their car disappeared down the dirt road, Brian sat at George's table and wrote a check for $180,000. Emma's surgery plus post-operative care, plus enough to cover Kenneth's bar restitution if he was smart enough to accept it. He sent it via Maggie with a note for Emma. Because she's my granddaughter and I love her. Use the rest however you need. Kenneth received the check on Monday evening, stared at it in his home office while Maggie watched from the doorway. Where did this come from? Your father. Emma met him yesterday. Kenneth's face cycled through shock, betrayal, confusion. You took her behind my back. She deserved to meet her grandfather, and he gave us this. No conditions, just love. Kenneth studied the check. $180,000, enough to save Emma's life and his career. Given by the father he was trying to declare incompetent. The irony was suffocating. His phone sat on the desk. Robert Williams's number was easy to find. Kenneth made the call before he could change his mind. I'm withdrawing from the petition. Robert's voice held satisfaction. Smart choice. Tell my father Emma talks about him constantly. Tell him he was right about all of it. Kenneth hung up and looked at his daughter's photo, at Maggie's face, which held relief and disappointment in equal measure, at the check that represented both salvation and condemnation. Some lessons could only be learned through loss. Kenneth was beginning to understand what he'd lost by choosing money over presence, security, over trust, fear over love. And he was beginning to suspect the price would be steeper than a conservatorship case could ever measure. Scott's apartment smelled like desperation and old takeout containers. The phone screen glowed at 2:17 a.m. with a name that made his stomach clench. Frankie. He could ignore it, could pretend the $85,000 he owed to Portland's least forgiving loan shark would somehow evaporate if he just stopped answering. But debt to men like Frankie didn't evaporate. It metastasized. 3 weeks, Scott. That's all you've got left. Frankie's voice carried the calm of someone who'd delivered this message 100 times. 85,000 with interest, or I send people who don't make phone calls first. Scott's hand shook holding the phone. The conservatorship, it's happening. 3 weeks, the house sells, I'll have your money. You better. Because you know what happened to Tommy Chen when he couldn't pay right. Scott knew. Everyone in the gambling circuit knew. Tommy Chen had walked with a limp for 6 months after Frankie's collectors finished their conversation. The medical bills alone had been more than the original debt. Clocks ticking. The line went dead. Scott sat in darkness and calculated the distance between here and rock bottom. Realized he'd already fallen past it weeks ago, was still falling, would keep falling until something stopped him, or he hit the kind of bottom you didn't get up from. The farmstead was 3 hours away. Scott made the drive on a Tuesday night, arriving at the property near midnight with a crowbar in his passenger seat and a plan that felt more like suicide than salvation. He'd break in while Brian slept, find whatever cash the old man kept around, take enough to buy 3 more weeks from Frankie. But Duke barked before Scott even reached the porch. The door opened backlit from within, and Brian stood there in pajama pants and an old flannel shirt. Scott broke. Right there on the porch in front of the father he'd thrown away, he crumbled into sobs that came from somewhere deeper than shame. I came to rob you. I have a crowbar in the truck. I'm 85,000 in debt to a loan shark, and I came here to steal from you. Brian pulled him inside, made coffee despite the hour, let Scott talk until words ran dry, and only silence remained, the kind of silence that holds space for truth instead of filling it with comfortable lies. Gambling addiction. Started with online poker 2 years ago, thought he had a system, won 40,000 initially, and believed his own brilliance. Lost 120,000 chasing that first win. Borrowed from Frankie when legitimate banks refused him. Now the debt had grown with interest into an amount that would take years to repay, and Frankie wanted it in weeks. Dad always said I was reckless. Scott's voice was hollow. Turns out he was right about that too. Brian poured more coffee. I wasn't right. I was judgmental. There's a difference. You tried to teach me responsibility, and I turned it into addiction, because I taught responsibility without understanding why you were reckless in the first place. Brian's eyes held something Scott had never seen before. Not pity, but recognition. I never asked what you were running from, just told you to stop running. The confession took an hour. Everything Scott had been carrying alone, the feeling of being invisible as the youngest child, watching Kenneth excel at law and Rebecca charm everyone she met. The gambling had started as proof he was smart, strategic, capable of something besides being the family afterthought. Had metastasized into need, then compulsion, then the kind of desperation that brought you to your father's door with a crowbar. I'll pay Frankie. Brian's tone allowed no argument. All of it. But you go to Gamblers Anonymous. You get help, and you testify honestly at the hearing. Scott's head snapped up. I can't testify for you. Richard Miller will destroy me. And I signed the petition. I'm legally bound. Then testify against me honestly. Tell the truth about who I am. That's all I ask. Why would you help me after what I did? Because you're my son. And I failed you by hiding who I was, by teaching you that competence meant never needing help, that strength meant never showing weakness. I'm done hiding. The wire transfer went through the next morning. $85,000 to an account Scott provided, the kind of account that existed in legal gray areas, and asked no questions about origins. Frankie confirmed receipt by noon with a text, "We're square. Don't come back." Scott stayed at the farmstead, too ashamed to face Portland, too broken to pretend anymore that he had anywhere else to go. Robert Williams arrived on Tuesday afternoon with witness lists and strategy documents. The hearing was 6 days away. Richard Miller had filed additional motions claiming Brian had manipulated community members through financial coercion, that the anonymous donations were evidence of impaired judgment rather than generosity. They're painting you as a cult leader. Robert spread papers across the kitchen table. Someone with delusions of grandeur buying loyalty from vulnerable people. Brian thought about Tyler Martin's surgery, the Johnson farm saved from foreclosure, the library roof that wouldn't leak on children trying to learn. How was helping people evidence of incompetence? Robert continued, "We need to counter with your financial history. Show the money was managed wisely, invested conservatively, grown strategically over decades. That kind of sophistication destroys their incompetence narrative." The question hung unspoken. Are you ready to reveal everything? Brian looked at Rebecca, who'd been staying in the guest room for 2 weeks, whose bruises from Donald had faded to yellow, but whose healing would take longer. At Scott, who'd spent 3 days helping repair the barn while attending his first GA meetings in Pendleton. At the life he'd built from garbage bags and betrayal. Yes, I'm ready. Millbrook organized with the efficiency of people who'd been taking care of each other for generations. 62 residents arranged carpools to Pendleton for the hearing. Sandra Anderson coordinated media strategy, ensuring the story framed Brian as competent victim rather than confused elderly man. Joshua Martin gathered character references from 3 decades of people George White had helped demonstrating the family pattern of strategic generosity. The night before the hearing, the church hosted a dinner for everyone traveling to court. 100 people packed the fellowship hall, sharing casseroles, and certainty that tomorrow would prove what they already knew: Brian Thompson was exactly who he said he was. Kathleen sat beside Brian while Duke slept under the table. "Whatever happens tomorrow, you're not alone. Remember that." Brian's hand found hers. "I spent 40 years being alone in a house full of children. This is what family actually feels like." Kenneth called at 9 p.m. His voice came through strained, careful, like someone relearning how to talk to a person they'd written off as irrelevant. "Dad, I'm testifying tomorrow for you, not against you. The hearing is about my autonomy. You already withdrew from the petition. I know. But I want to stand up there and tell a judge that I was wrong, that you saved my daughter's life while I was trying to steal yours. That matters more than whether it changes the legal outcome. Emma's surgery went well. Perfect. She's home recovering. Asks about you constantly. Maggie's bringing her to Thanksgiving at the farmstead if you'll have us." Brian's throat tightened. "I'd like that." After they hung up, Brian opened George's journal and made an entry. "Tomorrow, I stop hiding completely. Not just the money, but the choices that led to it, the secrets that shaped everything, the man I've been underneath, all the careful construction. Win or lose, they'll see me. That has to count for something." The Morrow County Courthouse looked different, packed with people who'd driven 2 hours to defend someone most of them had known for less than 2 months. 83 Millbrook residents filled the gallery, some holding signs despite the bailiff's request to put them away. "Brian Thompson is Millbrook," and "Generosity isn't incompetence," and one hand-drawn poster from a child that just said, "Thank you, Mr. Thompson," with a crayon drawing of Duke. 5 television vans lined the street outside. Sandra's article had transformed a routine conservatorship hearing into a human interest story about rural America, anonymous generosity, and whether doing good could be used as evidence of being bad at managing your own life. Brian entered with Robert Williams, Rebecca on his left, Scott on his right. Kenneth and Maggie waited by the courtroom doors with Emma in a wheelchair, the girl's chest bandaged beneath a Wonder Woman shirt. Emma waved with the enthusiasm of someone too young to understand the gravity of what was about to happen. Richard Miller stood near the plaintiff's table, looking like a man who'd realized his sure thing had complications. He was 55, silver-haired, expensive suit, the kind of lawyer who'd built a career on exploiting families during their most vulnerable moments. 22 conservatorships in 7 years. Average fee $340,000 per case. Sandra's investigation had uncovered the pattern, published it in the Chronicle, triggered a state bar inquiry that was now running parallel to this hearing. Judge Patricia Johnson took the bench at 9:30 sharp. She was 62, gray hair, pulled back severely, reading glasses on a chain, the kind of judge whose reputation suggested she suffered fools poorly and lawyers who wasted her time even less. This is a hearing on the petition for emergency conservatorship. Mr. Miller, you represent the petitioner. Proceed with your opening statement. Miller stood, buttoned his jacket with the precise movements of someone performing a well-rehearsed routine. Your Honor, this case concerns a man who worked hard, raised a family, contributed to his field. But age and isolation have damaged his judgment in ways he can't recognize. Brian Thompson lives alone in a deteriorating farmstead, gives away substantial sums without consulting family, has cut contact with his children, and demonstrates what my expert witness will describe as grandiose delusions about his role in the community. Brian watched Miller perform, recognizing the technique: start with sympathy, establish the subject as pitiable rather than dangerous, make the conservatorship sound like mercy instead of theft. His children love him. Miller gestured vaguely toward where Kenneth, Rebecca, and Scott should have been sitting together. They want him safe, supervised, protected from his own declining faculties. That's all this petition seeks to accomplish. Robert Williams rose for his opening, and the temperature in the courtroom shifted. Your Honor, this isn't about safety. It's about money. 3 adult children facing financial crises saw their father's home as a solution to their problems. When he refused to cooperate, they filed this petition to take control by force. What we'll show today is a man who's not only competent, but thriving, healthier, happier, more engaged with community than he's been in decades. The real question isn't whether Brian Thompson can take care of himself. It's whether his children ever bothered to see him as anything more than an inheritance waiting to happen. Miller called Dr. Roland Webb as his first witness. The psychiatrist was 68 bow-tie briefcase that probably cost more than most people's rent. He'd never met Brian, a fact Robert established immediately during cross-examination. You diagnosed Mr. Thompson from behavioral patterns described by his family. Webb adjusted his glasses. Standard practice in cases where the subject refuses evaluation. He didn't refuse. He was never asked. Regardless, the behavioral evidence: living in isolation, giving away money without family consultation, grandiose beliefs about his importance. These indicate impaired judgment. Robert pulled out a document. You've testified in 44 conservatorship cases in the past 7 years. How many times did you find the respondent competent? Webb hesitated. These cases are referred to me because there's already concern 0. You've found every single person incompetent. Would it be fair to say you're hired to provide a predetermined conclusion rather than an objective assessment? Miller objected. Judge Johnson sustained it, but the damage was visible in the jurors' faces. There were no jurors, but the judge's expression showed she'd absorbed the point. Robert pressed. Dr. Webb is generosity, a mental illness. When it's compulsive and irrational, is $124,000 irrational for a man with substantial assets? Webb's pause lasted 3 seconds too long. I wasn't aware of substantial assets. Robert let the silence stretch before dismissing the witness. Miller's case crumbled over the next hour. His evidence rested on the assumption Brian was destitute, making the donations proof of financial irresponsibility. But Robert had medical records showing improved health property assessments, proving the farmstead was being competently renovated, bank statements from the small account demonstrating careful budgeting. Then Miller called Scott Hill, expecting him to be the weak link, the desperate son who'd testify to anything to get his father's money and solve his own problems. Scott was sworn in, took his seat looking smaller than his 30 years, the weight of shame visible in his posture. Your father gave away $124,000 in 6 weeks. Miller's voice was confident. Did he consult you before making these donations? No. Did that concern you? Yes. Why? Scott met Brian's eyes across the courtroom. Because I needed money and he wouldn't help me. Miller smiled, sensing victory. And why did you need money? I had a gambling addiction, owed $85,000 to a loan shark. I asked Dad for help multiple times. He always said no. Miller's smile widened. So your father refused to help his own son while giving money to strangers. Scott's voice cut through the courtroom. He said no because giving me money wouldn't solve my problem. It would enable it. He was right. I was too broken to see it. So I joined this lawsuit out of spite. But then Dad paid my debt anyway, all $85,000. Required I get help, go to GA meetings, face what I'd done. That's not incompetence. That's wisdom I was too broken to recognize. Miller's face drained of color. The courtroom gallery murmured approval until the judge's gavel restored silence. Scott turned to Brian. Dad, I'm sorry. For the petition for the theft, I almost committed for not seeing you clearly enough to understand you were trying to save me from myself. You're the sanest person I know. Miller had no redirect. Scott left the stand and took a seat in the gallery beside Rebecca. Your Honor, Robert stood. The defense calls Brian Thompson. The walk to the witness stand felt longer than it was. Brian placed his hand on the Bible, swore to tell truth that had been buried for nearly 3 decades, and sat facing courtroom full of people who were about to learn who he actually was. Robert's questions were gentle, methodical, building the foundation, life as an engineer, the patent work, raising 3 children alone after Linda left, the decision to keep the wealth secret, to teach them independence rather than entitlement. Why come to Millbrook specifically? Brian's voice was steady. My children threw me out. I came to the only place I had left my grandfather's land, the place he'd shown me that a man's worth isn't measured in what he accumulates, but in what he contributes. And the donations, the anonymous help, I found my grandfather's records, Depression-era loans. He forgave families. He helped without expecting return. I had resources I wasn't using. He'd shown me what they were for. Robert introduced George's journal, the leather-bound ledger, decades of quiet generosity, documented in careful handwriting. Let the judge read selected entries while Brian sat in silence. Then Robert pulled out the box that had been sitting on the defense table since the hearing began. Linda's psychiatric records, the letters she'd never sent. Mr. Thompson, you've kept a secret from your children for 27 years beyond the money. Tell the court what it is. Brian's throat tightened. He'd rehearsed this moment, but rehearsal and execution were different species of difficult. My wife didn't abandon our children. She was mentally ill. Bipolar disorder with psychotic features. Severe postpartum depression after Scott was born. She left to protect them, not because she stopped loving them. I hid her illness because I thought the truth would hurt them more than absence. Silence in the courtroom was absolute. I was wrong. My secrecy about Linda taught them I couldn't be trusted. That vulnerability was dangerous. that the people who should protect you keep secrets that matter more than truth. I see that now. So if I'm revealing the money, I'm revealing this too. No more hiding, even when honesty costs more than lies." Robert let the moment breathe before asking his final question. "Mr. Thompson, what is your current net worth?" Brian looked at Kenneth in the gallery, at Rebecca, at Scott, at the judge, whose expression gave nothing away. $280 million. The courtroom exploded. Gasps, shocked exclamations, reporters frantically typing. Kenneth's mouth fell open. Rebecca covered her face with both hands. Scott stared at the ceiling as if asking God why he'd been too stupid to ask before joining a lawsuit. Judge Johnson's gavel came down hard. "Order! Everyone shut up or I clear this courtroom." The silence that followed was heavier than what had come before it. Robert distributed folders prepared by accountants, financial records dating back to 1994, patent sale documentation, investment portfolio statements. 32 years of meticulous money management laid bare for official scrutiny. $280 million from a data compression algorithm sold in 1994 for $8 million. A derivative patent in 1996 for $12 million. Conservative investments in index funds and municipal bonds compounding quietly while Brian lived on his engineering salary and taught his children that wealth was something you earned through work. Judge Johnson studied the documents with the careful attention of someone who'd been surprised but refused to show it. "These figures are verified." Robert handed her the accountant's affidavit, independently confirmed. "Mr. Thompson has managed this fortune for 28 years with the kind of sophistication most wealth managers would envy. The anonymous donations represent 0.04% of his total assets. Calling that irrational is like calling Warren Buffett reckless for donating to charity." Richard Miller approached the stand, trying to salvage something from wreckage. "You hid this fortune for nearly 3 decades. That's deceptive." Brian met his eyes without flinching. "Private, not deceptive. I never lied. Just didn't volunteer information that wasn't anyone's business. Your children were struggling financially. You let them suffer. They're adults who made choices. I offered time advice presents. They wanted money without relationship. I wouldn't enable that. 124,000 given to strangers. Not strangers, community members. I researched every recipient, verified need, ensured the money would be used wisely. That's more due diligence than most philanthropists bother with." Miller changed tactics, desperation creeping into his voice. "You isolated yourself from family, cut off contact. They threw me out and changed my locks. I found connection where they created absence. You manipulated an entire town. I helped a town because my grandfather taught me that's what you do when you have more than you need. They're here because they want to be, not because I bought them." Miller had nothing left, dismissed the witness with the kind of defeat that suggested his career might have just ended along with this case. Robert called character witnesses who testified with the efficiency of people telling obvious truth. Joshua Martin describing Brian's integration into Millbrook, his careful approach to giving his continuation of George White's legacy. Dr. Stephanie Harris presenting medical evaluations showing cognitive function in the 96th percentile. Physical health, excellent. Psychological state, sound. Kathleen explaining Brian's daily routine, his clarity of purpose, his obvious competence in managing both property and relationships. Sandra Anderson spoke about her investigation, how Brian's giving pattern showed methodical research and strategic impact rather than impulsive behavior. Every donation had been verified, tracked, documented with the precision of someone who understood money's power and weight. Then Kenneth took the stand, and the courtroom's attention sharpened. "Mr. Lee, you're one of the petitioners, yet you withdrew from the case." Why, Kenneth's voice was quiet but clear. "Because my father saved my daughter's life while I was trying to steal his freedom. He gave $180,000 for Emma's surgery, gave it without conditions, without hesitation to a son who'd just thrown him out of his house. Foolish. That's not incompetence. That's grace I didn't deserve, and wisdom I failed to recognize. You believed your father was incompetent when you filed. I believed he was poor and declining. I was wrong about both. But more than that, I never asked what he wanted, what he needed, whether he was actually happy. I just assumed he needed saving, because seeing him as helpless justified taking what I wanted. That's the incompetence here. Mine, not his." The cross-examination was brief. Miller had nothing to work with when the petitioner testified against his own case. Closing arguments were anticlimactic. Miller's was weak, going through motions for a case already lost. Roberts was surgical, itemizing every piece of evidence proving Brian Thompson was not just competent, but thriving, healthier than he'd been in years, managing wealth most people couldn't imagine with the sophistication of a professional fund manager. Judge Johnson removed her glasses. "I've presided over conservatorship cases for 30 years. This is the weakest petition I've ever seen." She looked at Scott, who'd returned to the gallery. "Mr. Hill, you testified against your own petition. That shows growth, your father's support, clearly enabled." To Kenneth and Rebecca, "You two withdrew, which shows integrity, but the damage you caused, evicting a competent adult from his home based on assumptions rather than evidence that's actionable if he chooses to pursue it." To Richard Miller, I'm referring this case to the Oregon State Bar. "Your pattern of conservatorship filing suggests financial exploitation rather than client advocacy. 22 cases in 7 years, average fees of $340,000, 0 adverse outcomes until now. That's a business model, not a law practice." The ruling. Miller's folder snapped shut with finality. "All evidence shows Brian Thompson is competent to manage his affairs. His financial sophistication is exceptional. His community integration is exemplary. His cognitive function is above average for his age. His physical health has improved since leaving Portland. The petition for conservatorship is denied." The gavel fell with the sound of endings and beginnings intersecting. The gallery erupted in respectful cheers. Kathleen hugged Brian while Duke barked from outside where he'd been banished during proceedings. Rebecca cried into Scott's shoulder. Kenneth held Emma and tried to explain to a 7-year-old why the adults were all acting strange. In the hallway afterward, Kenneth approached first. "Dad, I don't know how to fix what I broke." Brian's anger had burned out during the testimony, leaving only exhaustion and tentative hope. "You start by seeing me as a person instead of a problem. Everything else follows from that. Emma wants you at Thanksgiving. Maggie wants Sunday dinners. I want," Kenneth's voice cracked, "I want my father back." The one I remember from before I learned to be ashamed of needing you. I'm here. I've always been here. You just stopped looking. Rebecca was next, her eyes red from crying. I left Donald, filed for divorce. Police arrested him for wire fraud 2 days ago, unrelated to us, but the timing felt like justice. I'm rebuilding my business the right way this time. Ethical appraisals, honest dealing, no shortcuts. Proud of you. Mom's letters. Rebecca touched Brian's arm. I read them every night. I understand now why you hid things. But, Dad, no more secrets between us, even when truth is harder than lying. Agreed. Scott hung back until his siblings finished, then approached with the hesitance of someone who'd lost the right to assume welcome. I'm staying in Millbrook, if you'll let me, working for the foundation Robert helped you set up, learning how to give the way you and Grandpa George did. There's room at the farmstead, always has been. Emma wheeled herself over, Maggie pushing carefully. Grandpa Brian, you won. Brian knelt to her level. We won, sweetheart. You being here made the difference. Can Duke come to my birthday party next month? Duke goes wherever I go. So yes, the foundation launched in October with a mission statement that would have made George White weep with recognition, supporting rural communities through strategic generosity, helping families help themselves, building networks of care that outlast individual need. The board included Joshua Martin as president, Kathleen Robinson, Sandra Anderson, Robert Williams, and 2 others from neighboring towns who understood rural poverty from inside rather than through statistics. Brian served as advisor rather than president, refusing to let his name define the work. First-year grants totaled $14 million. 63 communities across eastern Oregon received support for infrastructure education, medical equipment, farm preservation. Applications were vetted ruthlessly. George's lesson about helping those who'd work hard and pay forward had been absorbed completely. Special programs emerged from the family's collective trauma. Second Chance scholarships funded people rebuilding from mistakes inspired by Scott's journey. Linda's Light Mental Health Fund provided treatment for rural families who couldn't afford care, honoring the woman whose illness had shaped 3 children's understanding of trust. Family Bridge programs connected estranged families with mediators and therapists, recognizing that wealth couldn't fix what broken communication had destroyed. Scott's transformation was documented in weekly GA meetings and daily work for the foundation. 6 months sober from gambling, 8 months living at the farmstead, helping Brian maintain property while learning grant evaluation and community assessment. The work gave him purpose beyond proving himself, connection beyond winning something. Rebecca's nonprofit Second Foundation Housing developed affordable homes using ethical practices and sustainable design. She hired people with criminal records, giving them construction training and second chances. The irony of being built on a foundation of mistakes wasn't lost on anyone, least of all Rebecca, who'd learned that acknowledging your failures was the first step toward transcending them. Kenneth left corporate law for legal aid, taking a 60% pay cut to represent people who couldn't afford the kind of defense wealth could buy. He and Maggie sold their large house, moved into something smaller, learned to measure success in impact rather than billable hours. Emma thrived post-surgery, her heart strong, her relationship with Brian growing through Sunday dinners and summer weeks at the farmstead. On a November evening 5 months after the trial, Brian sat on the farmstead porch with George's journal. Duke slept at his feet, grayer than in June, but still present, still loyal. The mountains caught the last light turning purple against darkening sky. Brian wrote, George, oh, I finally understand. Wealth without purpose is burden. Family without honesty is fiction. Community without contribution is loneliness. My children took everything from me and gave me the chance to find what I'd lost myself. The money was never the point. It was the tool. The treasure is connection with Duke at my feet, Kathleen beside me, grandchildren who know my name, a community that calls me neighbor and children, learning that love is presence, not transaction. Thank you for showing me the way home. Thanksgiving arrived cold and clear. Brian and Kathleen cooked for 2 days, preparing for the 43 people who'd RSVP'd. The farmstead had never held this many tables stretched across the restored living room into the kitchen, extra chairs borrowed from the church plates, mismatched but plentiful. Kenneth and Maggie arrived first with Emma, who immediately found Duke and rode him around the property like a small queen on a patient beast. Rebecca brought her new boyfriend, introduced tentatively, carefully, a good man who worked construction and treated her like someone valuable. Scott helped set tables, his hands steady, his eyes clear in ways they hadn't been in years. Joshua and his family, Dr. Harris with her husband, Sandra Anderson with her recorder turned off for once, Martha from the library, the Johnson family, Tyler Martin, healthy and grateful. Kathleen's sons had driven from Seattle, stunned to find their mother happy in ways they'd forgotten she could be. Brian stood at the head of the table after everyone had settled, Duke lying beneath where scraps would inevitably fall. The room held his attention, 43 people who'd become family through choice, rather than blood, through presence, rather than obligation. We're grateful for second chances, his voice carried through the room, for truth that heals even when it hurts, for family we choose and family we rebuild, for communities that catch us when we fall, for the reminder that worth isn't measured in what we have, but in what we give, and for the knowledge that being broken isn't the end. Sometimes it's the only way to become what we were meant to be all along. Emma's voice piped up from beside Duke, and for Grandpa Brian and Duke. The room echoed, for Brian and Duke. They ate and talked until darkness fell completely, until children grew sleepy and adults moved to coffee and quiet conversation. Brian stood at the window, watching Millbrook lights in the distance, feeling Kathleen's hand find his hearing, his grandchildren's laughter from the room behind him. His phone buzzed with a text from Kenneth. Thank you for not giving up on us even when we gave up on you. Emma says she wants to spend Christmas at the farmstead. I think we all do. Brian typed back. You're always welcome. That's what home means? Later, after everyone had left and the dishes were washed and Duke had been walked, one final time, Brian and Kathleen sat on the porch, wrapped in blankets, against November cold. Stars burned overhead with the clarity only high desert skies provided. You did it! Kathleen's voice held wonder. Built a life from nothing, from garbage bags and betrayal. Same thing sometimes. She kissed his temple. You taught a whole town that generosity isn't weakness. That's more valuable than money ever could be. George taught me first, and now you're teaching others. That's how it works. Legacy isn't what you leave when you die. It's what keeps growing after you're gone. Brian pulled her closer, feeling the warmth of her against the cold, the weight of Duke at their feet, the sounds of an old house settling into another night. His children had thrown him away because they thought he was worthless, had learned he was wealthy, and were now discovering that neither assessment mattered as much as they'd believed, because worth wasn't measured in net worth, wasn't calculated by what you owned, or who loved you, or how much you'd accumulated before death. Worth was measured in the Tyler Martins whose surgeries you funded, the Johnson farms you saved, the libraries you repaired, the children you raised even when they broke your heart, the communities you served even when they couldn't repay you, the dogs who slept at your feet, and the women who chose to sit beside you in the cold. You can judge a person's true value by what they do when no one's watching and nothing's demanded in return. Brian had spent 28 years proving that to himself. The rest of his life would be spent proving it to everyone else. The phone buzzed one final time. A text from Sandra. Great story. Brian. But I'm wondering, would you share it publicly? The anonymous donor angle is good, but the full story of betrayal and redemption could help other families. Think about it. Brian turned off the phone and set it aside. Maybe someday he'd tell the full story. Let Sandra write it. Let it reach people who needed to hear that estrangement wasn't permanent, that broken things could be repaired, that the worst moments sometimes opened doors to the best versions of yourself. But tonight, he just wanted to sit with Kathleen and Duke and watch stars wheel overhead. Wanted to feel gratitude instead of anger, connection instead of loneliness, peace, instead of the exhausting performance of being whoever his children needed him to be. They'd thrown him away because they thought he was broken. They were right. He was broken by loneliness and judgment, and the weight of secrets that had seemed protective but were actually isolating. But being broken wasn't the end. Sometimes it was the only way to make space for light to get in. Sometimes it was the beginning of becoming whole in ways you'd never imagined when all your pieces were still stuck together in comfortable misery. The owl called from the darkness. Duke stirred, sighed, settled deeper into sleep. Kathleen's breathing slowed to the rhythm of someone completely at peace. And Brian Thompson, 60 years old, $280 million, wealthy, immeasurably richer in ways money couldn't measure, smiled into the high desert night and thought about all the families he'd help tomorrow and the day after and all the days that followed, until there was nothing left to give except the example of a life lived for others instead of approval. It makes you wonder how often we judge people by their circumstances instead of their character. Brian's children saw poverty where there was wealth, incompetence, where there was wisdom, isolation, where there was community. How many people have you misjudged because you didn't look closely enough? And if this story touched you, if you've experienced a moment where loss became the doorway to something better, or watched someone rebuild after betrayal, share it. Not for Brian, who doesn't need validation anymore, but for everyone else who's standing on a porch in the rain with garbage bags, wondering if this is the end or just the beginning, dressed in ending's clothes. Because sometimes the people who break you are the ones who free you. Sometimes being thrown away is permission to finally become yourself. And sometimes the worst thing that ever happened turns out to be the best thing in disguise. You just have to survive long enough to recognize the gift.